Hi, I'm Gary Thomas, CTO of Logicalis Australia, and I'm here to introduce you to the Logicalis Virtual Private Data Center and some of its key capabilities. Firstly, I'll give you an overview of the Virtual Private Data Center itself, and then I'll touch onto other key aspects such as the networking, virtual machine creation, data protection, and also disaster recovery. The dashboard shows us some key components: compute, how many virtual machines, storage, how many gigabytes of storage we're using and the different tiers of storage, some other key aspects of the virtual machines such as do we have replication enabled, are any of those virtual machines failed over, and whether they're running in the primary or the backup data center. Now from this dashboard I can go to other key pages within Envisage. First one I want to show you is from the Internet Utilization page. I can take you to the Network Topology page. Now this gives you a very good overview of the concept of a virtual private data center. Very quickly you can see that we have a primary and a backup data center. Key components of the data centers are the ability to bring in your wide area network if you have that. You also have a firewall, an enterprise grade firewall. You have different security zones, often called DMZs, and internal routing capability. Another key aspect of the virtual private data center is the ability to span networks across your primary and backup data centers, and that's the concept of virtual networking. Moving on from the network page, from this page you get a very quick summary of all the virtual machines running in either data center. You get a state of how these virtual machines are running, whether they're switched on, switched off. I have a thumbnail of the virtual machine. I can shut it down, power it off. A quick view of the processing load on the virtual machine and whether this virtual machine is replicating to the backup data center successfully. From here I can click on the thumbnail and launch into a virtual console. This gives me actual access to the console of the virtual machine itself. I can perform administrative tasks on the virtual machines, install software, basically anything that you need to do on a virtual machine and treat it as your own. Okay, you've seen the architecture, so let's go in and start to configure some of these features. In the Virtual Private Data Center, you have the ability to create different security zones. Key to that is orchestrating the creation of interfaces on the enterprise firewall. Let me show you how we create different DMZs or security zones within the virtual data center. So you have a requirement for an application that needs an additional DMZ or security zone. It's as simple as clicking on the Add Network button. I'm going to call this DMZ2 and I'm going to give it an IP address range of 1042.43.0, and I've also decided I need to duplicate this network in our backup data center. This application has disaster recovery requirements. Creating the network, I can also say this network, I want it to be either a high metric or a low metric. That means if it's a high metric, it will be not preferred in the rest of the network. Low metric means it will be the preferred network. I also need to connect it to the firewall as it is a DMZ. The firewall will have an IP address of 10.42.43.1. Click the Add button and the platform will create the DMZ2 network in both data centers at the same time. You can also see it's applied a high metric on the backup data center automatically and a low metric on the primary data center. I've now got the ability to create virtual machines that need to reside on this DMZ network, and I can then put rules in this firewall to allow internet connectivity through to those particular virtual machines. A key part of any disaster recovery strategy is to simplify the networking. You need to have networks that are smart and can move from data center to data center. You do not need complexity within the virtual machine to make up for a lack of smart in the network itself. So adding a virtual network allows me to have a consistent IP addressing scheme as I move virtual machines from one data center to another data center. So let's create another virtual network and I'll give that an IP address of 10.3.1.0/24. I also include what is the IP address that virtual machines will use as a default gateway. And you can see the Server Farm 3 is now available as a virtual network. This network, it doesn't matter where your virtual machines are running, whether it's in the primary data center or the backup data center, they can be connected to Server Farm 3 and communicate to any other resource in either data center. Let's show you how we can now create a virtual machine and make use of this technology in the underlying network, clicking through to the Virtual Machine Manager page. Now, it's as simple as clicking the plus button on the virtual machine grid and typing in appropriate information. So I want to create a VM, call it VM10, and selecting an operating system. Now, the operating system can either be predefined operating systems or images that you've created earlier. So I'm going to choose a predefined Windows Server 2012. Network connection is determined earlier. I've decided I need to connect this to Server Farm 1. The resources settings is where I can determine how much memory and how many virtual processors are required for this particular virtual machine. It's as simple as sliding these sliders and clicking the next button. Here's my confirmation page, showing me all the details so I can make sure that I've got it right, and then clicking finish. That will then kick off the process of actually creating the VM. I can see that the VM has been created and it's in a creating state. If we wait a short time, the VM will go into a created state and it will be ready to run. So I can see now that I've got a virtual machine that's been created. It's currently in an off state. It's as simple as hitting the power on button. And we'll watch this machine power up for the first time. And again, I can connect to the console and watch this virtual machine boot up. Now, as part of VM creation, you need to accept the licensing terms for the operating system. Just let me shrink this down a little bit to show you if you do have a low resolution screen, you can scale the console. So let's accept that. I can set my settings for the operating system, and as part of this, I also need to set the password. This operating system is ready to go. Are you struggling with data protection issues in your data center at the moment? Do you take regular backups of all your virtual machines? Do you make use of scheduled snapshots to protect you? Let me show you how we do that in the Envisage platform. I'll click through to the Virtual Machine Manager page. I have a virtual machine that I've created earlier, and by going through to the settings on this virtual machine, I have two primary features, backups and snapshot. Backup is as simple as enabling backup and selecting my retention period. Snapshots can be done in a very similar way. I can enable daily snapshots, and again, I get to choose a retention period on those snapshots. Hitting the apply button will save these changes for this particular virtual machine. Have you addressed all the requirements for disaster recovery in your data center at the moment? Do you replicate your key virtual machines? Do you have a simple failover mechanism in place? Let me show you how we do that in the Envisage platform. So I have a virtual machine that I created recently, and I need to enable replication of this virtual machine. It's currently running in the primary data center, so by enabling replication, the platform will automatically start that replication to the backup data center. So going to the settings page, I click on the replications tab, enable replication. You can see it's already chosen. I will replicate to the backup data center, and I hit apply. So the replication is kicked off, and depending on the size of the hard drives on this virtual machine, it could take anywhere between 2 to 3 to 10 minutes to do that initial replication. Now what I want to show you is how I can do a planned failover from the primary data center to the backup data center. And now with the virtual machine shut down, the failover virtual machine button is now enabled. And that will start the failover process. Highlighting the virtual machine again, I can now see the virtual machine is designated as running in the backup data center and it's in a failed-over state. In this state now, I can power it back on. Now it's important to remember, as this virtual machine is being failed over from one data center to the other data center, the virtual networking that it's connected to will see that the virtual machine has moved. So now you can see how we've addressed those complex issues of disaster recovery, replication and failover in the Envisage platform.